The envelope wasn't addressed to me. That's the first thing I noticed when my neighbor, Mrs. Patton, handed it to me on a Tuesday morning. She'd found it tucked against the wrong mailbox. Mine, even though the handwriting clearly spelled out my husband's name. Came yesterday, she said, watching my face a little too carefully. Thought you should have it. I thanked her, closed the door, and stood in the hallway of our Chicago apartment holding a plain white envelope like it was something fragile or something dangerous. I wasn't sure which. My name is Callie. I'm 31 years old, a trauma nurse at Northwestern Memorial, and I've held the hands of dying strangers with a steadier pulse than I had standing in my own hallway that morning. The envelope had no return address. The postmark was Indianapolis. My husband, Marcus, had never mentioned Indianapolis. I set it on the kitchen counter, made coffee, stared at it for 11 minutes before I finally opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a folded note. The photograph showed Marcus at what looked like a restaurant. Low lighting, wine glasses, white tablecloth. He was smiling. Not the careful smile he'd been giving me lately. The one that never quite reached his eyes. This was his real smile, the one I fell in love with 8 years ago. He was looking at the woman across from him. I recognized her immediately. Her name was Dana. She was a physical therapist at the sports rehabilitation clinic 2 floors below my unit at the hospital. We'd eaten lunch together. She'd come to our wedding 3 years ago, sitting near the back, clapping politely during the first dance. The note said only 5 words, in handwriting I didn't recognize. She deserves to know the truth. No signature. Nothing else. I read those 5 words 4 times. Then I folded the note, slid it back into the envelope, and finished my coffee. My hands didn't shake. That's something they don't tell you about real grief. It doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down at your kitchen table, and waits. Marcus was still asleep in the bedroom. His overnight bag from his most recent work trip sat half unpacked near the closet. He was a cardiovascular device sales representative, which meant travel every other week, sometimes more. It had always seemed reasonable. He was good at his job. We had a nice apartment. I'd never questioned the rhythm of his absences the way I probably should have. I went to work that morning and said nothing. In the trauma bay, I function best. There's a clarity to it, the noise, the urgency, the protocol. You assess, you act, you move to the next thing. Doubt has no room to breathe. I'd become very good at leaving the rest of my life outside those sliding doors. But Dana's unit was 2 floors down, and when I passed the elevator at 11:40 that morning and saw her step out, laughing at something on her phone, my throat closed like I'd swallowed something sharp. She didn't see me. I kept walking. That night I waited until Marcus fell asleep. Then I sat at the desk in the second bedroom, the one we'd been quietly calling the future nursery for the past year, and I opened his laptop. He'd never changed the password. We'd always shared everything, or so I'd believed. I told myself I was only looking for something that would tell me the photograph was wrong, that maybe there was context I was missing, that maybe Mrs. Patton's too careful expression and 5 anonymous words had led me somewhere that didn't mean what I thought it meant. What I found instead was a folder inside his downloads, unlabeled, sitting between a car insurance document and a software update. Inside it were 47 photos. I didn't look at all of them. I looked at enough. Some were from hotel rooms, some were from restaurants. In 3 of them, I recognized Dana's laugh in the tilt of her head, the way she leaned in like the whole world had narrowed to the person in front of her. I closed the laptop carefully. I sat in the dark for a long time. My mother's voice came to me then, the way it always does when things go quiet. She's a retired Army chaplain's assistant, my mother, a woman who spent 20 years listening to people unravel and finding the thread that put them back together. She used to say, "The truth will always find its own way out. Your only job is to decide what you do when it arrives." The truth had arrived. I still hadn't decided anything. The next morning, I called in for a half shift and drove to my mother's house in Evanston. She lives in the same 2-story on Maple where I grew up, the one with the green shutters and the wind chimes on the porch that my father hung before he passed. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, already somehow knowing I was coming even though I hadn't called ahead. She looked at my face and pulled out a chair. "Sit," she said. "I'll make eggs." I told her about the envelope, the photograph, the folder. I kept my voice even the way she'd taught me. Facts first, feelings second, because feelings without facts are just panic. She listened without interrupting, which is its own kind of love. When I finished, she set a plate in front of me and sat down across the table. She didn't say "I'm sorry" or "Are you sure?" or "Maybe there's an explanation." She said, "What do you need to know before you can take a step forward?" I thought about it. "Everything," I said. She nodded. "Then find out everything." That's my mother. Not fight for your marriage or walk away. Just know what you're walking into before you move. I started with what I had access to. Our shared calendar, which I'd always assumed was mostly doctor appointments and dinner reservations. I went back 6 months and looked at it differently this time. Not as a record of our life together, but as a map of Marcus's patterns. Conference in Indianapolis, February. Client meetings in Milwaukee, March and April. A team dinner in downtown Chicago on a Tuesday when I'd been on a night shift. I cross-referenced with his credit card statements, which were linked to our joint account. The hotel charges matched the trips. What didn't match was a second set of restaurant charges in cities where he claimed to be somewhere else entirely, or home. The Milwaukee entries bothered me most. He'd said both trips were for a hospital system client, 3 nights each time, but the hotel receipts showed a property in a neighborhood called the Third Ward, which I knew from a nursing conference I'd attended 2 years ago. It was not a business district. It was the kind of neighborhood you chose because it was romantic. I printed nothing. I photographed the screen with my phone instead, keeping my evidence mobile. A habit I didn't know I had until I was already doing it. At work, I began paying closer attention to the rhythms of the floor below mine. I wasn't following Dana. I was simply noticing. When she arrived, when she left, who she ate lunch with, whether she ever mentioned Marcus's name in passing. She didn't. But twice in 1 week, I saw her glance at her phone in the hallway with that private expression people wear when a message arrives from someone they're careful about. On Thursday, I was restocking a supply cart near the elevator bank when I heard her voice. She was on a call, half turned toward the window, thinking she was alone. "I know," she said. "But it can't keep going like this. She works in this building." A pause. "I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm just saying something has to change." She ended the call and turned to find me 3 feet away. The color drained out of her face. "Callie," she said. "Long week," I said, and pushed the cart around the corner. My hands were perfectly steady. I've held pressure on arterial bleeds. I know how to manage what happens inside my body when everything outside it is falling apart. That evening, I did something I hadn't planned. I called my closest friend from nursing school, a woman named Priya who now works as a nurse practitioner in Atlanta. She knew Marcus well. She'd been a bridesmaid at our wedding. She'd also, I realized as I was dialing, stopped mentioning him in our calls about 8 months ago. I'd chalked it up to busy schedules. I hadn't chalked it up to anything else. "I need to ask you something," I said when she picked up. There was a half-second of silence on her end that told me everything before she said a word. "You already know," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Since Tuesday," I said. She exhaled slowly. "I didn't have proof, Callie. I had a feeling. At your birthday dinner last year, the way he looked at his phone when he thought I was watching. I didn't know who, and I didn't know for certain. I've been carrying it for months." "You should have told me." "I know." Her voice was quiet. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of what it would do to you. "It's worse not knowing," I said. "I know that now." We stayed on the phone for an hour. By the end of it, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not comfort exactly, but clarity. Like when a storm finally breaks and the air pressure shifts and you can breathe again. Marcus came home that night from another late client call, smelling faintly of a restaurant I hadn't suggested. He kissed my cheek, asked how my shift was, poured himself a glass of water, Watching him go through those ordinary motions felt like watching a film where only I knew the ending. I answered his questions. I smiled at the right moments. I set 2 plates on the table as if everything was exactly as he believed it to be. I needed one more piece before I moved. The next afternoon, I requested a meeting with our hospital's HR liaison, not to report anything. Not yet. I told her I was dealing with a personal situation that might affect my schedule and I wanted to understand my options. She was kind and professional and asked no questions I wasn't ready to answer. What I actually needed was a neutral institutional space that made what I was doing feel grounded, procedural, real. Because the thing about discovering something like this is that you begin to distrust your own perception. You wonder if you're the one who's unraveling. You need someone outside the situation to look at you and confirm that you're coherent. She did that without knowing that's what she was doing. That Saturday, Marcus had plans to watch a game with friends on the north side. He left at noon. I waited 40 minutes, then drove to the address I'd found on one of the hotel confirmation emails. Not a hotel this time, but an apartment in Lincoln Park registered to a subletter. The name on the lease application, which I'd found as an email attachment titled Apartment Stuff, was Dana's. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. I just needed to know whether the address was real. It was. I sat in my car for a while, watching the building the way you watch something that you already understand but haven't finished absorbing. A young woman walked out with a dog. A UPS driver left a package. The city moved around me like nothing was wrong with the world. I thought about my mother's wind chimes. I thought about the nursery we hadn't filled yet. I thought about how I'd spent 3 years building a life around a person who had apparently been building something else, in parallel, the whole time. Then I put the car in drive and went home. Sunday night I made dinner, the way I always did when Marcus was home. The salmon he liked, the roasted vegetables, the good wine we kept for no reason evenings. I lit the candles on the table. He looked pleased and slightly guilty, which I'd come to understand was just his face now. After we ate, I told him to leave the dishes. I poured us each another glass of wine and I sat across from him at the table and I said, quietly, without drama, "I need you to be honest with me tonight." He looked at me carefully. "About what?" "About Dana," I said, "and Indianapolis. And the Third Ward. And all the rest of it." The glass in his hand went very still. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slide evidence across the table the way they do in movies. I just waited, the way my mother had taught me, because silence, used right, tells you more than anything you could ask. "How long have you known?" he said at last. "Long enough," I answered. "I want to hear it from you." What followed was the kind of conversation that peels back every comfortable thing about a shared life and makes you look at the structure underneath. He said it had started 14 months ago during a stretch when I was working double shifts covering for a colleague on medical leave. He said he'd felt alone. He said he hadn't meant for it to become what it became. He said he'd been trying to end it for 3 months, but it was complicated. I listened to all of it. I asked clear questions. I didn't cry. Not then, because I had more to say. "I need you to understand something," I told him when he'd finished. "This isn't just about the 2 of you. This is about the life we said we were building. The nursery. The decisions I made about my career, my schedule, my future. I made them based on a version of you that you were pretending to be. You didn't just cheat on me. You let me keep investing in something you'd already walked away from." He flinched. "I hadn't walked away from you. You'd built a whole other life and called it complicated," I said. "That's the same thing." He opened his mouth to argue and then didn't. I told him I needed him to stay with his brother for a while. I told him we would handle the practical things, the lease, the finances, the logistics, calmly and without destruction. I told him I wasn't doing this out of anger, even though anger was there, somewhere beneath the clarity, burning low and steady. He asked if there was any way forward. I told him I didn't know, and that was the only honest answer I had. After he left, I stood in the kitchen with the leftover salmon and the good wine and the candles still burning. Then I blew them out, one at a time, and I washed the plates by hand the way I'd watched my mother do 1,000 times. Slow, deliberate, like the act of cleaning something was itself a kind of prayer. In the weeks that followed, I learned things about myself that I'd been too busy to notice before. I learned that I was better at being alone than I'd given myself credit for. I learned that the friends I'd slightly neglected during the easier years of my marriage came back quickly when I needed them. Priya first, then others. I learned that my mother was the steadiest presence I had, not because she had answers, but because she never pretended the questions were simple. I also learned that the hospital floor has a way of keeping you honest. You cannot feel sorry for yourself beside a patient who is genuinely fighting to stay alive. You cannot wallow when the work is real and the need is immediate. Nursing had always grounded me. Now it anchored me. Dana transferred to a different hospital 3 months later. I heard through the staff grapevine and felt less than I expected to. Whatever she and Marcus had, that was theirs to carry. I'd stopped making it about her the moment I'd understood it was really about him. About the choices he made, the person I'd trusted, the promises that hadn't held. Marcus and I signed separation papers on a Thursday afternoon in a downtown attorney's office. He looked tired in a way that I recognized as genuine, not performed. When we shook hands in the lobby afterward, because somehow that's how it ended, a handshake, polite and final, he said he was sorry in a way that sounded like he meant it. "I know you are," I said, and I did. Knowing someone is sorry and staying are two different things, and I made my peace with that distinction. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, reluctantly, then all at once. I took a week off in April and drove to Evanston and stayed in my childhood bedroom with the slanted ceiling and the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd pressed to it at age 9 and never fully removed. My mother made pancakes every morning. We watched old movies. We walked along the lakefront in the early evenings when the light turned everything gold. One afternoon, she handed me a small wooden box I recognized from her closet. Inside was my father's chaplain pin, the one he'd worn at every ceremony that mattered. She placed it in my palm without saying anything and let me figure out what it meant. I held it for a long time. My father had believed that the hardest kind of courage wasn't the kind you used in a fight. It was the kind you used to be honest with yourself in the dark, when no one was watching, and the easier thing would be to look away. I'd looked. I hadn't looked away. I went back to work in May with something different in my posture. Not harder, not angrier. Steadier, maybe. My charge nurse noticed. "You seem like you figured something out," she said one morning, filling out an incident report at the nurses' station. "Maybe," I said. "Or I figured out that some things don't need to be solved to stop hurting." She nodded slowly. "That's about as smart as it gets." In June, the hospital's wellness committee asked me to speak at a staff resilience workshop, a quarterly event for nurses dealing with burnout and vicarious trauma. I said yes before I thought too hard about it. I stood in front of 18 colleagues in a conference room on the 7th floor and told them a version of the truth that didn't require all the details. I told them that the past year had asked me to practice what I'd always preached to patients, that recovery isn't linear, that asking for help is a clinical skill as much as an emotional one, and that the hardest part of healing is accepting that you're allowed to be both competent and hurt at the same time. A newer nurse, maybe 24, raised her hand at the end. "How do you keep going when you feel like the ground under you has shifted?" I thought about it. "You find the parts that didn't move," I said, "and you stand on those." She wrote it down. That evening, I called my mother from the hospital parking garage, still in my scrubs, sitting in my crubs as the city quieted around me. The wind chimes played faintly through the phone when she answered. She'd taken the call on the porch. "How'd it go?" she asked. "It was good," I said. "I think it actually helped someone." "Of course it did," she said simply. "That's what you do." I leaned my head back against the seat and looked at the sky between the buildings, a strip of dark blue going softer at the edges. I thought about the envelope I'd held in my hallway 11 months ago, and about all the ways a single moment can restructure everything that comes after it. I thought about how differently I'd imagined this year would go. The nursery conversation, The plans Marcus and I had sketched loosely at kitchen tables, believing we were building toward something solid. And I thought about what we do when the building turns out to be different than the blueprint. We learn what we're made of. We call the people who answer. We show up in our scrubs and hold someone's hand in the dark, and remember that the showing up, was always the part that mattered most. I still have my father's chaplain pin. It sits on the windowsill of my apartment, catching light in the mornings. Some days I pick it up and turn it over, feeling the weight of it, the permanence of a thing that outlasts the person who carried it. I don't know what the next year looks like. I've stopped trying to know in advance. What I know is what my mother told me the morning after everything came down. Standing at the stove in her apron, handing me a cup of coffee before I'd even asked, because she always knew. "You didn't lose yourself in this, Callie," she said. "Some people do. You didn't." I'm not sure I believed her then. I believe her now. If you've ever been handed a truth you weren't ready for, if you've sat in your car in a hospital parking garage or a kitchen hallway or a driveway and felt the ground shift beneath you, then you know that surviving it isn't about being unbreakable. It's about choosing over and over again in small, ordinary moments to keep going anyway. That's what I've learned. That's what I'm still learning. And if this story found you at a time when something in your own life is asking you to look closer, to ask harder questions, to stop looking away, then maybe that's exactly why you're here. Share your story in the comments below. Someone out there is waiting to hear that they're not alone.